Well, good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you. For the record, I am Matt Rodriguez, the Secretary for Environmental Protection here in California, and I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. I think that your comments actually have really captured the essence of what went on in Paris. I'll focus on then today on really addressing the three questions that you addressed to me in the letter inviting me to speak here today. And that is that there was a question about what influence does California climate policies have on the international discussions and negotiations. Secondly, you asked me to address how the Paris Agreement will affect California's climate change efforts, both in the near term and in the long term. And then you asked how are the goals of the International Climate Accord, as well as the broader dialogue in Paris, reflected in the administration's second auction proceeds investment plan. Let me deal with each one of these in order. First, as to California's influence on international negotiations, I'll just say as a personal matter, I'm always a bit uncomfortable claiming leadership for myself or programs. It's easy to claim such things. I tend to believe, however, that actions and the reactions you get from others speak more loudly than statements that we're a leader. Against this background, however, I'll have to say that my personal discomfort aside, it's correct to say that California's climate policies and the policies embraced by the governor and supported by this legislature and led by this legislature in AB 32 have indeed demonstrated leadership and had considerable influence across the world in international circles. This isn't just a claim, this is the reality. One of the things that became immediately clear to me upon becoming secretary was that thanks to California's history of progressive environmental policies and innovative programs, including the adoption by this legislature of AB 32, much of the world was already watching California when I got here. I quickly discovered that leaders in China, Europe, Mexico, and the rest of North America knew of our progress in energy efficiency, of our promotion of renewable energy, and our advances in alternative fuels and our incentive programs for zero-emission vehicles. And they were watching as we prepared to launch the cap-and-trade program that we were going to adopt in collaboration with the province of Quebec. Now, over the last several years, the interest in California and what we're doing here has only increased as these programs have advanced. Other countries want to know how it is that we're achieving the goal of 33% renewable energy. They want to know how we're going to reach our target of 50% renewables. And they've watched very carefully as our cap-and-trade program has performed as well as any of us could have reasonably anticipated. While we're also reaping the additional benefit of generating billions of dollars in funds that we can further invest in programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, they understand that we are on a path to meet our 2020 goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, and that we intend to further reduce these emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. And finally, as you all have noted, they're keenly aware of the fact that this has all been accomplished as California has rebounded more quickly than the rest of the country from the recession that hit in the 2000s, and has now developed a budget surplus instead of a budget deficit. In fact, it's when I talk to these other countries and other subnationals that they remind me that California and its 38 million residents represent the seventh largest economy in the world. In short, California, I think, to the rest of the world has demonstrated the art of the possible. We've demonstrated how it is possible to have strong, effective policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and maintain and grow an economy at the same time. Now, this accomplishment has been noted by other countries, as I've said, and it explains why the governor and the representatives here, Senators Pavley, Wieckowski, Senator Pro Tem De Leon, were all invited to tell the California story in Paris. People want to know what's going on in California. So the reality is that California has not just influenced the international discussions on climate change. I think it's fair to say that it has helped to establish the standards by which all of these programs around the world are being measured right now. So this leads into your second question concerning how the events in Paris will affect California's climate efforts in the near and long term. The main answer to this question is that it means that California is going to have partners with whom we can work to achieve our shared goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and preventing global warming. In the year preceding the Paris negotiations, California worked with the German state of Baden-Württemberg, another government that has taken note of California's programs and that is similarly committed to mitigating climate change. And we worked together to advance a memorandum of understanding entitled the Under 2 MOU. The goal of the MOU is to engage subnational, as you've identified, meaning state and regional level jurisdictions, to commit to a consistent and ambitious set of long-term climate goals, in line with holding the average global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has established as a threshold for preventing dangerous climate change. Now, specifically, jurisdictions joining this MOU agree to reduce their emissions to 80 to 95% below by 2050, or to limit emissions to 2 tons or less per capita by the year 2050. Now, the MOU does not set out any single path to this goal. Rather, recognizing that economies and circumstances differ throughout the world, each participating city, state, region, and province is invited to prepare an appendix document that identifies the unique combination of policies and pathways that they will take to facilitate deep emissions reductions in their jurisdiction. The agreement also identifies 7 areas of cooperation and best practice sharing, ranging from renewable energy and transportation to short-lived climate pollutants and working on natural lands. As an example, California's appendix recognizes that our biggest source of emissions is the transportation sector, and it identifies many of the programs that we have here in California to deal with emissions related to transportation. Additionally, we discuss our innovation in the energy sector and how increasing both energy efficiency and renewable energy at the same time is a dual goal here in California. And we also target emissions reductions and carbon sequestration opportunities concerning California's agricultural and natural landscapes. Our Under 2 statement includes deep reductions in each of these 3 main policy areas, or carbon sequestration, identifies carbon sequestration possibilities in these areas. And while some of the other signatories to the MOU are targeting different sets of emissions with a different emphasis in their own country. Now, what this means is when I came to Cal EPA in 2011, I was frequently answering questions about why California was pursuing its ambitious climate programs when it appeared that governments around us were not following suit. The import to me of Paris and the accord that was reached there is that this is clearly not the case anymore. Instead, California is one of many states that's on the leading edge of the world movement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent climate change. This is demonstrated by the fact that with Baden-Württemberg, within a 6-month period after we started circulating the MOU, we recruited 121 other jurisdictions to join and support the Under 2 MOU. Together, these jurisdictions represent 27 countries and 6 continents and more than 729 million people, or $20.4 trillion in GDP, which is equivalent basically to 1/4 of the global economy. And our efforts didn't stop in Paris in December. We continue to contact and work with our Under 2 partners, signing additional regions from Colombia and Austria last week, as well as Massachusetts, which I'll note is our first state with a Republican governor. We're also working with to develop a secretariat at the Climate Group to manage Under 2 relationships to assist our partners in this enterprise in developing their specific climate policy appendices, and to coordinate information sharing amongst all the partner jurisdictions. The Climate Group will work with us to track emissions reductions and to ensure the authenticity of the reductions as they're reported through another compact called the Compact of States and Regions. So to answer your second question, I think it's clear to me that what really Paris means is that now and into the future, California is not alone in responding to climate change, and in fact, we are benefiting from having a large number of partners around the world. Now, finally, you've asked me how the goals of the International Climate Accord, as well as the broader climate dialogue of the Paris negotiations, how this is reflected in California's climate investments and policies. Now, as I noted at the outset, Matt Olney from the Department of Finance is here, and he can provide greater detail on the administration's investment plan, which was recently submitted to the legislature. So I'm going to confine my response to this question to 3 brief points. First, I do want to emphasize that this plan represents a collective effort by Cal EPA, Chair Nichols and the Air Resources Board, the Governor's Office and the Department of Finance, as well as many of the agencies and departments implementing greenhouse gas reduction fund programs in this state. The goal was to update a plan and really present you with a plan that would start California on a path to meeting the governor's 2030 emissions target of reducing emissions 40% below 1990 levels. Now, the plan is also the culmination of many workshops and outreach to communities that comprise California. It recognizes that continued emissions are necessary in the transportation, energy, and waste sectors. It also identifies the additional carbon sequestration potential that might be realized through the management of natural and working lands. Further, it will limit emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, that is, potent gases with shorter lifespans than carbon dioxide that are nonetheless very, very important components in the climate change puzzle. And it will promote investments in sectors of the economy and in our natural lands that we think will be beneficial to the state of California. We specifically worked to identify investment potentials in areas that the public thought we might have overlooked in the first investment plan, such as looking for investments and possibilities in California's rural areas. My second point would be that the breadth of the investment plan reflects much of what we've learned in the Paris negotiations and in our other discussions with climate leaders, and that is that a wide range of policies may be necessary to combat climate change. It's not enough to really focus on just one approach, say energy efficiency, in one emission sector, say the transportation sector. Instead, to meet our ambitious climate targets, we need to consider where we can obtain reductions in many areas. And that goes from reducing the use of fuel by encouraging the use of public transportation or zero-emission vehicles, to limiting the need to use fuel at all by doing a better job of promoting alternative modes of transportation and encouraging sustainable communities so we can walk and bike in those areas. Increasing the energy efficiency of our existing building stock and realizing the carbon benefits that can arise from wiser use of our agricultural and natural lands are also important initiatives. In sum, our international discussions have confirmed that there's no one way to achieve the carbon reductions we need. So we need to be innovative and we need to look for reductions where we can find them. Finally, it's important to conclude with the recognition that we must take additional steps to ensure that all segments of society benefit from our emissions reductions policies. One of the concerns voiced in international discussions of climate change programs is that communities already facing cumulative environmental burdens should not be further disadvantaged by these programs. As an example, lower-income communities should not be called upon to suffer disproportionately from increases in fuel or energy costs that might arise from renewable portfolio standards or emission trading programs. Fortunately, in this regard as well, California is already ahead of the curve and following the requirements of Senator De Leon's SB 535. The governor's budget and investment plan targets the investment of cap-and-trade funds in our most disadvantaged communities. No less than 25% of the over $3 billion allocated in the governor's budget must directly benefit these communities. And it's our expectation that through programs like the Energy Efficiency Weatherization Program, the Urban Forestry Program, the Strategic Growth Council's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, and transit and intercity rail programs, all Californians will be able to share in the economic and environmental advantages of our climate programs. So that's a real priority as we look ahead here. So with that, I hope that I've given you some answers to the 3 questions that you posed. And unless you've got any questions, I'll step aside and give Chair Nichols an opportunity to discuss the Paris Agreement and what we should be doing next, both internationally and here in California, to successfully implement that agreement.
I'd like to hear from all the panelists before the illustrious panel starts asking questions. Ms. Nichols, good morning and welcome.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
That's the extent of the French you're going to hear from me, because that's about as far as I can go. I think others have already done a very good job of highlighting the success of our delegation in Paris. And so I'm going to simply mention the fact that the success of the Paris Agreement does build on California's success in the past in demonstrating, as we have ever since we started working on air pollution many years ago, that economic growth and environmental protection can go together, and not only can go together, but must go together. And now that we have a growing body of evidence to build on, not only in terms of the very dramatic and visible success that we've had in attacking smog in the area that had the worst air pollution in the country, but we've also succeeded in showing that while doing it, the measures that we took were beneficial for our economy. And so that really is the California story. There are many details behind it, but it's a body of work that's been built up by successive legislators and governors over a period of 50 years. And it is why other places look to California, and increasingly, as smog is recognized as a scourge in many big cities around the world that don't have the same policies that we do for dealing with fuels and vehicles, that haven't had the ability or the foresight necessarily to invest in renewable energy and so forth, California becomes even more of a global magnet for people who are interested in these topics than it did before. So what I want to talk about a little bit is what's in this agreement and how we intend to, and already are, working to try to implement it. I did prepare in my written testimony, which either you already have or will shortly have, a 4-page side-by-side comparison of the Paris Agreement's goals and California's climate policies. So I will get it to you, and I won't read it, but it's a side-by-side comparison, and I think it'll be hopefully a useful reference for you and for all of us when this topic comes up. But just a few, pardon me? It compares the Paris Agreement goals or provisions with the California climate policy. So that's the comparison. California versus Paris.
We'll get.
Do we have copies here? We'll get them to you, or I can. Okay, I'm not going to read from it. I just want to highlight a couple of things that are in the Paris Agreement that I think are worth noting. First of all, the agreement itself actually recognizes the critical role of all levels of government in addressing climate change, which California has championed through the Under 2 MOU, as you've heard, and has for a long time. This is something that a few years ago, Senator Pavley will remember, in Copenhagen, we were fighting for recognition of the role that states and localities play as the actual implementers of most of the programs that national agreements are based on, and frankly, fighting to get into the place where the agreements were being negotiated. That was that would have been helpful. Anyhow, we have finally arrived in that sense, and I think that is important. The goal that you heard of holding the global average temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius which is contained in the governor's April 2015 executive order, is also part of the international agreement. Recognizing that partnerships with other jurisdictions are necessary. It allows for parties to actually cooperate by trading climate mitigation activities with each other, not cap and trade necessarily, but whatever mechanisms they can work out. It also establishes a mechanism for monitoring and inventorying sources and sinks of air pollution, of global climate pollutants, which is similar to the annual emissions inventory that we do. It ratchets up ambition over time. It requires a tracking of progress and reporting back on a regular basis, which of course our legislation does. And it recognizes the need to provide incentives and to invest in regions where help is needed the most. I think if there was one thing that in Paris I learned was surprising to people, people really were not aware until we came there of the extent to which our AB 32 implementation, as a result of this legislature's action, the SB 535, but also the ongoing education that I think we've all received about the need to make sure that every part of the society is involved in and benefits from our climate programs. And so that was an area where I think we had something to talk about that people frankly weren't expecting that we were going to be talking about. And so thanks to Senator De Leon, that became one of the areas where people were seeking us out for further conversation. So what are we doing now? Because even before we got to Paris, we were already starting to plan what we were going to be doing afterwards. And as Secretary Rodriguez pointed out, continuing work on implementation of the Under 2 MOU is a critical piece of this. And we'll continue working with not only those who are signed, but others who haven't yet signed but may wish to do so in the future. But we'll also keep focusing on other states and on our national government on a couple of very critical policy areas. Certainly President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which focuses on reduction nationwide from the electricity sector, is of great importance to us, even though California can comply with the federal regulations relatively easily. There are ways that that program could be implemented that will be beneficial to us economically by encouraging the potential for other states to actually purchase renewable energy from California. So we're not always the state that's buying from other people, but can actually help balance our electricity load and use our existing resources more efficiently by greater benefits on regional, greater emphasis on regional programs. Working with the Obama administration in their remaining time, we still have some opportunities, I think, to look at the immediate climate benefits of cutting short-lived climate pollutants, especially in areas where there is some funding available and potentially could be more in areas particularly including agriculture, methane emissions, and phasing down of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which is also within the federal ambit as well. I want to particularly focus on the short-lived climate pollutant issue because this is another area where California has been a leader. We are recognized around the world for our leadership on cutting black carbon emissions that come from diesel engines and diesel fuels, but we need to do more to focus on methane. The word methane is now, headlines these days in Southern California and unfortunately around the country because of a massive leak that's occurring in a natural gas storage field. But the reality is that we emit methane from many different sources in California, and some of the potentially best targets of opportunity would come from putting waste streams to a more valuable use. So the areas of renewable energy, renewable gases, renewable fuels coming from landfill gases coming from organic waste materials, coming from the dairies in the valley where, the technology exists, but creating the financial incentives to actually spread the use of dairy digesters as far as they can and should be used. These are things that we need to be working on, and these require, unfortunately, continued efforts by both, I think, the legislature and the agencies to overcome some of the institutional and economic barriers to deploying the technologies that are already there. If we can succeed in doing this, I believe we will unlock a torrent of investments in new industries and new markets for clean technologies, as well as bringing dollars and jobs to rural California, which is something that we certainly need to be doing. Mobilizing investment was a major theme at the Paris conference, and it needs to continue to be a theme for us as well. Success in achieving these very ambitious goals that the agreement calls for will only come if we can mobilize capital to flow towards clean energy, clean transportation, and away from the sources that are the primary drivers of climate change. So pricing carbon, we've already done it in California, but the price is, although it's real, it's not enough to actually drive changes in behavior. We need to think about where we're headed with that over the long term, because we've established that we can run a cap and trade program and that it can be done in a way that does not jeopardize our economy. But if we're going to be ratcheting down on emissions in the future, as we need to consider whether we're going to continue with this program, make it more broad or more effective. And that's something that obviously we'll all be talking about together in the course of the next year or so. Finally, of course, we in California are spending public money directly investing in efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions through the investment of the cap and trade auction proceeds. I need to mention that we don't always talk about it because it doesn't run through the Department of Finance's investment plan, but one of the most important things we're doing in investing cap and trade money is giving a climate credit to every customer of an investor-owned utility in the state of California. So if you live in a territory that is served by Southern California Edison or PG&E or San Diego Gas and Electric, every 6 months on your bill, you see a climate credit. That is a form of investment of the funds that have come through this program to protect the ratepayers of the state of California from experiencing undue increases in energy prices as a result of our cap and trade program. This is something that was implemented rather quietly, not a lot of fanfare about it, but it's proven over time that it can help protect our public and at the same time move us in the direction of increasingly stringent carbon emissions requirements in the state of California. So this has been an important piece of the program. The money that comes through the investment plan is a small fraction of the total value of the allowances that are in the cap and trade program. But those funds, as you know, have been very readily absorbed by a variety of programs that were developed in accordance with a strategy intended to, again, demonstrate that we can continue to reduce emissions in ways that also realize additional health and economic and environmental benefits. So I know that you want to get to that topic of the investment plan, and I think I will stop at this point and turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Almy. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Almy.